UFO sightings often run along a fairly consistent template. Strange shapes moving in the sky, perhaps odd noises, or even a glimpse of some unknown being. But sometimes these cases escalate and go much, much further, leaving us with far more questions than answers. The case we'll discuss today runs along these very lines. For another episode of UFOs Revisited, I'm joined by Ron Murphy, Heather Mosier, Katie Page, Micah Hanks, and Mark Matsky. My name is Aaron Deese. Welcome back, everyone. So today we're discussing what is admittedly one of my favorite UFO contactee cases. There's a lot to unpack here, there are a lot of little details, and it's also strikingly well documented. This case is referred to by a number of names, but I'd like to know, right out of the gate, what do we know about the Caracas dwarves?
Well, let me paint a picture for you, if I may. Imagine it's the late fall of 1954. You and a buddy are in Caracas, Venezuela, walking down a lonely road, and all of a sudden you see out of nowhere this orb flying, And before you can really wrap your mind around it, four little hairy beings come out. And of course you're curious, so you want to catch them, and they end up kicking your butt. Basically, that is the setting for the story about what's going to happen. I think we'll probably get into it a little bit deeper than that, but that's basically the gist of it.
And one of the things that's interesting about this case, I mentioned that it's well documented. We have names, we have times, we have dates. We won't be able to go over all of those minutiae details today, but if one is interested, you can do research and find out addresses and very, very minor, seemingly minor facts that seem to add to the weight of this story. Two initial witnesses were men named Jose Ponce and Gustavo Gonzalez. And I've heard a couple accounts. I've heard that they were walking through the woods. I've heard another that states they were driving a truck, making a late night delivery. This is supposed to have taken place between 2 and 2:30 in the morning. So well after sunset, darkest part of the night. And it's a very, very interesting case because, as you said, Ron, they don't just witness these beings entering or exiting this craft. They have a physical confrontation with them, where they seem to engage in some combat. And we'll talk a little bit more about the details of that as well. But off the top of the dome, do any other cases involving physical confrontations with potential extraterrestrials come to mind for any of you?
I think the Travis Wold case in some regard, because he did attempt to fight back. But this is an interesting case. I guess the Hopkinsville goblins, whenever there was an exchange of gunfire and things. But something like this is really unique in the annals of UFO incidences.
One reason for that uniqueness, by the way, also, that it seems to be kind of that the humans were the instigators of that conflict in this case. You look at Hopkinsville and how the Sutton family is defending their home, allegedly, against these little goblin-like creatures that are trying to enter or do whatever they're trying to do. In this case, we have humans who are seemingly driven by interest in what they're seeing, who pursue, engage, and then the conflict arises.
That's right, yeah. Well, who wouldn't want to go wrestle with a little 3-foot-tall humanoid furry creature? That's just in our nature, right? We want to go up and give it a little cuddle.
Anything that scares me, first inclination is to run straight toward it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Come on over here and give me a hug. One of those kind of deals. But as it turns out, that wasn't a good choice.
Didn't a whole bunch of more, like 20 of them, come out of the wood line?
You know what? I'm not sure if that is actually part of it. I think that these four little guys was able to take care of these two adult guys.
Oh,
I think
okay.
that's what happened.
I thought there were more that came out.
And there is a timeline that's documented as far as how many they saw and when they were documented. They first saw this glowing orb-like craft hovering over the road, and then as they're approaching it, they want to check it out, they apparently tripped over or stumbled upon one of these little creatures in the darkness. Again, this is 2:30 in the morning. They then realized there were two more who apparently came to the aid of the first one. The fourth one would appear a moment later, but not before Mr. Gustavo Gonzalez attempted to pick up and wrestle this creature in an apparent attempt to capture it, as I mentioned a moment ago. It's described in different accounts as being between 20 and 50 pounds, so fairly light. And the description of the creatures is very striking because it's not something I've seen repeated in other cases that I can think of. They were described as being 3 to 4 feet tall, possibly having fur or some kind of shaggy overcoat, not having ears, mouths, or noses, but having prominent eyes. One description that the men gave said they might have been wearing some kind of a dome or a bowl, a helmet of some kind over their heads. And in the midst of this scuffle, Mr. Gonzalez takes out a knife in an attempt to defend himself or subdue the creature, and it bounced off of its skin, making a metallic noise. And we mentioned the Goblins or the Hopkinsville incident a moment ago. That's not the only parallel to that case. The Caracas incident would take place in November of 1954. The Hopkinsville incident would take place in August of 1955. So less than a year later, we have two cases with small, creatures of demure size, striking physical features, who seem to have some kind of a resistance to at least ballistic physical damage.
And like you said, without the age of the internet too, this isn't like this is instantaneously known.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And the source of the Caracas Dwarves story comes from a local newspaper that documented at the time, El Universal. I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly. It was later passed on to researchers who were English, Spanish speaking, who brought the story over to the United States. It's been documented in books, one of which I have here on the table by several different authors, but it originates with this very local newspaper story, and this specifically took place in the town of Petare, which is a suburb of Caracas.
Now you left out a crucial detail though, okay? Helmets, hair, eyes, but they also had loincloths.
Oh, yes.
Right.
Right.
See, yes. You have to have that little bit of demure to you, so when if you're out there attacking people on a dirt road.
Modesty is important.
It is. It is. Yes. If one is attacked in the dark by, say, a hairy attacker, one should not be without one's loincloth.
As absurd as it sounds, though, I mean, it is interesting that in some ways this is almost sort of derivative of, some of the science fiction that you read of the gospel. We haven't said that before, that there are science fiction parallels to UFO cases. But in this instance, I mean, seriously, you think about, some of the representations going all the way back to like Edgar Rice Burroughs. Obviously Tarzan comes to mind, but, this sort of projection of these inhuman dwarves, presuming they aren't human, maybe of alien, provenance, clad in loincloths, though. There's kind of an interesting juxtaposition, especially with a helmet. So there's this blend of technology and also a sort of feral quality represented in multiple different ways, both in the garb and the actual animalistic appearance with the hair. So it's kind of a strange kind of a pairing, even as far as ufology goes, and that despite the fact, as we'll discuss a little later, that there were quite a lot of reports that involve alleged hairy bipeds, as ufologists would call these. Cryptozoologists might have different names for them, but yet again, it's interesting to see that there are even some interdisciplinary elements there regarding the description of beings and their behavior.
Mm-hmm. They were also said to have retractable claws, which they used to give the two witnesses several scratches. I believe Mr. Gonzalez, when he was examined by a doctor later, had bruises along his left side. These men had medical treatment. They reported it to the authorities. That's why it was picked up by the newspaper. So again, this is very, very well documented. Another interesting aspect of the initial encounter with these four beings, and I know Katie will appreciate this, the fourth one appeared apparently after the initial scuffle with the first three kicked off, and was seen to be carrying what looked like either soil samples or rocks of some kind. So we connect back to this other thing that we've talked about in a couple of other cases of them apparently collecting soil samples of some kind.
They were there doing nothing but, taking specimens, we come upon them and start, bothering them. That's probably what happened.
Yeah, we just wandered in their territory.
That's right, yeah. But this is one of those cases, I think that we've talked about this before. Something happened, right? So we have to decide, kind of figure out what happened. Are we going to take this story at face value? And if we do start digging deeper, is there other alternatives that we could come up with?
There was a lot of odd things happening in that area around that time. One of the earlier reports was in April of '54, and the creatures that were described as like half human, half monkey, small creatures that were aggressive, coming after a hunter as he was on his way to his car, grabbing him, wrestling him to the ground. He was able to try to attack him, like picked up a rock and was able to smash the creature in the head, and it presumably was able to bleed a little bit. So it had some human-like qualities in that manner, but that was all predating the Caracas dwarves, but this was still in Caracas just a few months earlier. And before the little half man, half monkeys were seen, there were lights in the sky as well. So we had that precipitating it. There was just all kinds of weird stuff happening in the time leading up to that.
Which in itself is kind of an interesting perspective on this, because really, not only was this information getting back to America thanks in part to the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, or APRO, Jim and Coral Lorenzen. I think that they had a number of contacts down there in South America, Venezuela in this case, but I've spent a lot of time in South America myself, mostly in Brazil. They have a rich tradition of UFO sightings, and that's important because you'll hear people today say this is an American-centric phenomenon. America has a UFO fixation. That's not necessarily true. You go to a lot of other countries and you'll find that they have just as deep a history and as much fascination with this. So, in the 1950s, while all this was happening in the United States, it is important to point out that in other parts of the world, particularly in South America, there were a wide range of different encounters, and some of them seem to show this kind of continuity like you're describing. Animalistic traits paired with, what we might consider to be diminutive humanoids that are more consistent with the general kind of UFO landing sighting. And then one more thing, too, also the spherical craft that they described with this sort of cupola on top, a row of window-like orifices on the front that, the creatures are actually, I think, at one point seen looking through by the witnesses. And you still hear those descriptions of these metallic spherical UAP. Right now, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office have described this as their target package. Metallic spheres, anomalous, objects. We don't liken them to being balloons, apart from just being kind of shaped like them. But these things can move Mach 2, go from hover to Mach 2. They emit radio signals, all kinds of interesting things. So there's even a bit of a throwback, to these early cases where we see with Caracas a very similar description to things that right now the Department of Defense is looking for.
Yeah, I think this is an important case because here we have these hairy beings. Now these are little ones, maybe like Ewok types, but they're seen in conjunction with craft, which makes it important for the UFO field. But it also reminds me of like Stan Gordon's work in the Sasquatch that are seen around craft. And that begs the question, are these little beings extraterrestrials themselves? Are they piloting these crafts? Are they workers? Are they just going out to get these soil samples? And is there somebody else flying the craft and they're just out there to collect because they're small and they can maneuver well, and boom, unexpectedly they had to defend themselves. So I think it's interesting, the connection between these little hairy beings and the craft.
Yeah, it has a very Chestnut Ridge type feel to it. If you were just to isolate the case and say, where do you think this happened? It sounds like something, as you said, out of Stan Gordon's work for sure. And just cultural context type stuff, shout out to 1954, which has been noted before. The year of the original Godzilla.
Yes, I knew that. Yes,
atomic age angst writ large. And the year that The Creature from the Black Lagoon was released by Universal Pictures, which is set in South America and has this whole story about being attacked by a creature from the dark depths of the Amazon River in that case. But there's this whole idea is being represented yet again, that discovery, as humans press into these places that are wilder, they keep running into things that want to kill them. And this is all going on in the background. I don't know how wide a release that would have had at that point, but certainly movies like it, and Beast from 20,000 Fathoms and others, are putting out these ideas of monster attack.
Yeah, it's very, very popular cinematic trope at the time. Television and movies were exploiting that idea. It's really fascinating, and it's alleged that at the end of this encounter, these beings retreated into the craft, apparently jumped into it, and it was supposed to be several meters above the road, so that's interesting as well. And it shot up into the sky and disappeared without making a sound. That's an important detail we're going to come back to in just a moment. But there is also supposed to be an implement that these creatures used.
It was like a wand, like a tube-like wand technology that was able to shoot beams of light and paralyze people instantly. It just reminds me of the Loveland Frog, or the first Loveland Frog with the 55 case, with the little wands that could...
Well, they call whites as well.
Right.
Too, yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, they had the same technology. That's right.
Yeah. Or that one.
Well, and again, the chronological correlation, Frogman was 55, this was 54. So that's two incidents that took place in the next year with some of these visual, at least, similarities. Yeah. It's confounding.
It is. It's very much so. Of course, South America does have, as you said, a rich tradition of their own kind of stories and folklore. You have the duende down there, which is these diminutive creatures very similar to what Europeans would call goblins. So that is already part of a culture. What's interesting, though, is now these creatures are connected with something from beyond. Well, that makes it so interesting, right? Is because they don't have any cultural references to pull from. So that's what. So, you know, there are monkeys that are native to this part of the world. You know, so you would think that they were going down the road one time, somebody trips over a monkey that's part of a troop, and the troop kind of attacks them. But there's so much more to this. You know, why did they connect? If they were making up the story, if they were having some sort of connection, why did they make it something that was extraterrestrial? You know, yeah.
Well, and these men were known, apparently, even their employer was interviewed as a part of this research process. And these men were known as not being troublemakers, not being drinkers or partiers. They had never been late or missed a delivery, apparently, at whatever business exactly they were running. So, you know, again, you have an instance where someone does have a reputation on the line. These guys had a job. They were on the clock. If you are late, show up covered in bruises and say, I saw an alien, and you're not convinced that that's what happened, that's a very odd approach to just, you know, maybe you got out of the truck to use the restroom and you fell down a ditch. That's I would just tell that story if that were what really happened.
An important point there too, you mentioned, you know, their profession and people who had vouched for their character. My understanding had been that they had essentially been dealing in tools used in pork butchery and barbecuing and things like that, and they were going to go and possibly be making a delivery. So the individual that they had worked with in that regard, so they were never late, you know, in terms of their deliveries. The police had also been queried about this. I think they were advised when they showed up, I think at a tavern, and reported this, and they had not themselves been drinking, and that had been noted at the time, but it was advised that they report that to the police.
That is a part of the official police record, apparently,
and the
according
police,
to these sources.
And they said that they deemed the men to be credible and obviously very excited about something that they had experienced, as is the case with a lot of these kinds of UFO encounters, where somebody late at night on a lonely stretch of road encounters something they can't explain, and then they go to the authorities. Yet, strangely, some have tried to nitpick that aspect of it too. You know, why run to the tavern and tell them about it first before you go to the police? Kind of like if you look at the Pascagoula abduction, right? Hickson and Parker, who were taken aboard this craft and examined, as they say, well, they run first to the newspaper and it's closed, so then they go to the sheriff. But it's also revealed that there was a tape recorder running in the room, unbeknownst to them. The sheriff records them talking, and they remain in character the entire time he's out of the room. Instead of saying, hey, we're going to pull one over on this guy, they're saying, my God, what just happened to us? So there are even some parallels there in the sense that, yeah, they went to the nearest place where they could, and they talked about what they experienced. Police said they seemed credible after the fact.
But they went to the nearest public place. Just because it happened to be a tavern doesn't mean,
If I were completely, potentially in shock and had experienced something that not only expanded but challenged my entire worldview, I mean, I'd probably stumble into the closest gas station or supermarket and say, my God, you know, and it's like you want to grab onto the earth to keep from falling off at that point, and you're trying to ground yourself. And I'm imagining that's kind of what they did.
Right, and that time of night, there's not much open.
That's right.
Taverns are open. I mean, typically 1, 2, you know. Yeah. So maybe they went to the first location where there was another human, and that's what I would seek out as well. So that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Did they sustain injuries from this?
Yeah, there was alleged to be scratches and bruising, some of them perhaps a result of these retractable claws that are described. And one of the men in particular had bruises all down his left side and was examined by a doctor.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it too, is that a evidently well-known doctor was driving behind these two and witnessed the entire event. Mm-hmm. And later told authorities that he had witnessed the fight, but was reluctant to come forward and did not want his name attached to it at all because of what it would do to his reputation and business. Mm. But that's an interesting layer to have someone with that level of respect in the community say, I saw everything and it's just as they said. Mm-hmm. I can vouch for that, but you know, his credibility was at stake, so he didn't let his name be published anywhere.
It's very understandable. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But you said about this having a bit of an analogy to the Chestnut Ridge, and I think that's something that we have to point out as well too, because Bigfoot by itself is an anomaly, you know, and worthy of discussion. But whenever it is teamed up with these UFO sightings, it takes on a different life of its own, right? This is whenever they become impervious to bullets, right? People will shoot at them and they'll disappear. And sometimes they're even seen holding spheres of light. And being in the same vicinity whenever a UFO either takes off or lands, or sometimes both. So this correlation between something that is anthropomorphic, hair covered, and has a connection with the other, I think is a good place to start connecting dots and figuring out why only these types of creatures are seen doing that.
You know, if you ask those who are proponents of, again, what they would scientifically call relict hominoids, but this is just essentially referring to the same thing as Sasquatch or Bigfoot, some in that camp, as I'm sure Small Town Monsters team members will know, I mean, they even like to further distinguish that from cryptozoology. And then, you know, even further removed from the idea of the, you know, possible continuity with UAP sightings. Now, for me, if we want to study the whole history, we have to look at all of it. And you can't deny the fact that, you know, researchers like Ted Blecher and a number of others over the years, Jerome Clark, they have looked at the fact that, you know, in the vast, you know, summary of different kinds of humanoid sightings, hairy bipeds, they're usually preferentially called by UFO researchers. I mean, they do show up quite often, and not only in the Americas. Jacques Vallée, also the editors of Flying Saucer Review, and their excellent an anthology back in the 1960s on, you know, the humanoids, that was the title. So it's literally just looking at sightings with landing incidents where humanoids were observed, often dwarfish characters, and sometimes also hirsute, you know, hairy bipeds. They do appear. So this is something that is quite prevalent, especially in the 1950s and 60s UFO lore. Less so today. And I'm a little curious about that aspect of it. Why were there so many sightings in the, especially the 50s and 60s, with not just hairy bipeds, but all different kinds of occupants? And that on up into the 70s, then we have the abduction phenomena just erupt into the 80s and on into the 90s. But here in the 2000s, you know, we got up into the 2020s, and we almost never hear about even any sightings of occupants at all, except for rare instances like the Las Vegas thing. So, you know, where did they go? Do we still have stories like that? Do we hear credible stories of similar things today?
You don't, especially, you know, in my neck of the woods in western Pennsylvania. You think that you would hear about that all the time. But back in the 70s, that was just common. You know, that was a common thing. You know, these things that were running up on people's porches, they were bilocating to people's, you know, people seeing them at different places at the same time. But that was just almost standard fare for incidences involved in the 1970s. Yeah, this is one of those cases, though, where I think that it does have a really unique connection to these other Bigfoot reports. I really do.
I think maybe we're more heavily armed now than we used to be. Yeah, and maybe that's why they're like, no, you know, we don't want to fight these guys anymore, ever, you know.
Right. Also, I think if I were a cryptozoologist, and that's all that I do, right, unless I see that thing coming out of a craft, I'm not going to report strange lights, right? Because that's not, you know, especially if you are a flesh and blood ape guy, right? That now breaks my idea of how these things operate within our world. So I'm thinking a lot of the research might be overlooked and not reported, because very few people actually see them, you know. But there's so many places around the Chestnut Ridge where UFOs are seen almost on a daily basis, and then a UFO or a Bigfoot shows up in one of these spots as well too. Is there a correlation, or is it just happenstance? I mean, are two very strange paranormal experiences happening coincidentally?
There are a lot of dynamics that have to be considered right there. I mean, because we've got, I think, the issue of selective reporting. You know, some people, if they see something even anomalous, but it doesn't conform to what they expect of that anomaly, they may selectively report only certain aspects of it, right? And that's kind of a challenge in itself, but trying to understand all the different reasons why we may not get the full story. Because you do, frankly, I mean, hear about this. People say that sometimes in conjunction with these, you know, hairy biped reports, there are also strange lights. Not always what we would interpret as being UFOs per se, except for the part that they are unidentified aerial phenomena, but more likely kind of like ghost lights or something would be a better description. Mark?
Well, that's actually provable in Bigfoot literature. That's what this is all making me think of, is, you know, having done some reading on the subject, there's plenty of cases that are like classic Bigfoot Sasquatch cases that, especially in the older generation of books, you read them and they're sort of boilerplate Bigfoot experiences. But if you keep reading, what you discover is that what you thought was a simple sighting of a flesh and blood creature, turns out there was some other part to that story, light in the forest, an orb that descended or that they were even carrying in the case of the Chestnut Ridge famous case, that was omitted. That was not reported in some of these books, and others they are included. And it is absolutely a situation where, for one, to be considered as plausible within this field of orthodoxy, I can't let that strange stuff into the report. Just the Bigfoot stuff. Just, if we found tracks, great. We saw the hairy creature in the woods, that can be included. But if that same report included a saucer landing in the same vicinity, that will be unreported and left out. And so that's absolutely at work in the Sasquatch field. And that says a lot about bias, says a lot about human nature, and who we're trying to please with the reports that we make.
Yeah, and that as a result of certain stigmas, certain preconceptions, or concerns about how we may be perceived. I'm already going to tell you an extraordinary story, but I have to limit how extraordinary it may be so that you'll believe it. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, whereas in fact, and I try not to say that I'm just a person who studies UAP or just who studies folklore, just who studies cryptozoology. I try to look at all of it. I'm kind of a Fortean, or an anomalist, you might say. You can be critically minded, but you also have to look at the whole picture. And if you leave out some of the data, cherry picking is probably not going to do you any good in the long run.
Right. The classic example of this is Ape Canyon. In the Fred Beck story, typically when people hear Ape Canyon, if there's recognition with that, there were prospectors in their cabin that got pelted with rocks because they killed a Sasquatch by shooting one.
And there were flesh and blood creatures, and that's it.
Yeah, right, exactly. And isn't that scary, But you get into Beck's actual story, he was a spiritualist. He was led to the mine by spirit guides and arrows in the sky that he saw, and that all plays into it. And a lot of people just don't know that, because the way that many flesh and blood researchers are compiling data and presenting it is they just want you to see that there were these footprints and these men reported this experience with hairy creatures throwing rocks at their cabin. But that leaves off an important part, almost the crucial part of the story. And to Stan Gordon's credit, who we've mentioned a couple times here, he's very, very good at saying, this is the report as I received it. In total, make of it what you will.
Collect the data, and you can interpret the data, but make sure you collect all the data first, and try not to project your ideas and your beliefs onto it. Just take it for what it is. Although you will, if you look back at the old newspaper reports of Ape Canyon, every now and then you'll catch a little nod. Fred Beck and his companions swore that they weren't engaging in any table rocking or anything up there on the mountain. So it seems that there were some hints that the reporters knew about his spiritualist beliefs and things. But yeah, that is often left out of the story by today's standard.
Right, that the attack was more spiritual warfare than it was like
he even insinuated mountain devils.
Devils,
and
exactly.
that they literally...
It was an evil intent, demonic intent even, yes. I'm sorry I cut you off.
Oh, I was just going to say, I really appreciate and respect Stan Gordon's willingness to, where we compartmentalized all these different phenomena. He really took some heat for being one of the first people to really speak out about the Pennsylvania UFO Sasquatch connection. And just even now, today, these are breaking down, these compartmentalizations of these different subjects are just now breaking down. So in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you're absolutely right. I have a question though, with the Caracas doors, when they were fighting and squabbling, did he hear anything audibly? Did they make any noises, communicate in any way?
That's a very interesting question. I'm glad you brought us back to that, because the auditory aspect of this encounter is another really striking facet of it. We're going to take a little bit of a diversion and come right back to that, because we're talking about putting together the whole picture and considering the whole case. There were multiple, at least 9 independent reports from the nearby suburb of Petare concerning strange noises and lights in the sky. For example, these are just a few. Maria Antonietta Avellaneda was woken between 1 and 2 a.m. by a detonation and whistling sound. Concepcion Garachan saw a strange light in the sky 2 hours before the initial incident, so around midnight, and at 2 a.m. heard a detonation. Her sighting was accompanied by several additional witnesses who also spoke to the newspaper reporter. Manuel Soria saw a powerful light in the sky at 2:30 a.m. It was also witnessed by his mother, and Avelina del Paso stated that a police and military detail, a large one, were patrolling Petare after the explosion noise was heard by multiple residents. Now, what's interesting is when the craft is seen to lift back up into the sky, Ponce and Gonzalez describe it as being silent, and yet we have all of these other reports from other witnesses who saw something strange in the sky, who over and over again used the terms detonation and explosion sound. Now, one thing that was speculated on is that these explosion noises may have been a result of weapons being used by Pablo Escobar. So that's a whole other historical avenue we won't go down right now, but I think it does speak to kind of the mindset of people in this place at this time. So now, as far as the creatures making noises, that I don't have any information on. Does anyone else?
Well, let me just interject something, because the primary witness is saying that there was very little noise that they knew of in the general, immediate vicinity, but others exterior to that heard sounds. Anybody familiar with the Oz factor? The idea that Jenny Randles, especially back in the 80s and 90s, had written about the fact that, and I've found some very compelling UAP reports even more recently, where people describe in close proximity to the aerial phenomena, sometimes they won't be able to hear other sounds around them. Sometimes it's described as being, I was in the forest and suddenly all the wildlife became immediately silent. Yeah, some people describe a slowing down, or even sometimes feeling a sort of a static in the air that makes them feel like they're in almost like a liquid environment, or something like they're moving through peanut butter or something. One of the best and the classic examples that really illustrates possibly what we're hearing about here occurred at RAF Chicksands. This would have been back in the 1960s. It was a call that was made effectively anonymously to the National UFO Reporting Center back when Robert Gribble, the original operator of the hotline, was running it. And a young woman called in and said that while she was a girl growing up on that base, an RAF base where her father had been stationed at the time, she and a girlfriend were out playing badminton one afternoon, and suddenly they noticed they couldn't hear each other talking, and they were just, a few feet away from one another. And then she became aware of this dark kind of, circular disc-like object hovering over a nearby tree. And while the object was near them, suddenly they ceased to be able to hear any sound, but then when the object took off, she could hear again. And an interesting little addendum to that report is that her father wouldn't talk about it much, but years later when queried, had said, those things were seen at multiple different strategic locations around the world that day, was what the intelligence we had on that indicated. But I was interested in that case for the so-called Oz factor, this unusual auditory phenomenon, or the lack thereof, that occurs in proximity with UAP cases. Now, I don't know if that's what happened with the Caracas incident, but it wouldn't be implausible, in terms of other similarities in UAP reports from over the years, that the immediate vicinity would be generally quiet. Other people say that they're hearing loud noises exterior to that.
And I would, just to kind of add on to that a little bit, I grew up in Central Florida during the shuttle program, and it's not at all unusual for people that live on the east coast of Florida to abruptly, in the middle of the day, for no reason, hear what sounds like an explosion. The walls of your house rattle, maybe something falls down, you panic for a moment and then realize that's just the sonic boom of the shuttle re-entering the atmosphere. So without knowing a whole lot about aviation, or obviously knowing anything about what this craft was, perhaps it did have a silent propulsion system that generated some kind of a sonic boom when it left the atmosphere. That's just a possibility. But it's, again, so interesting. There's so many layers to this case that I really think are worth weighing.
I thought that immediately whenever they said about the boom too. I just assumed that was, especially if they had to get out of there in a hurry, Yeah.
And it kind of sounds like, if you look at it from the alien perspective, it almost sounds like this was a group of college students embarking on a scientific study, and everything went south. They broke rule number one. They broke the prime directive.
Well, you actually encounter that a lot. I mean, you see shades of that in a lot of classic UFO cases, where you can imagine the occupants, oh great, what do we do now? He's laying on the ground, or, oh great, they're following us, what now? Oh gosh, we've been spotted, guys, get back. I mean, there's almost a comical, and I'm not the first person to point this out. Jacques Vallée has frequently over the years, over the decades, commented on the absurdity of a lot of these cases, specifically with reference to these small occupants, humanoids. He said that about Socorro, he said that about Valençol, he said that about a lot of these cases, that there is a sort of comedic, almost absurd component. And that somehow that is a part of this whole contact experience, that the utter absurdity of meeting these diminutive little people who point a pencil or a wand at you and you're frozen, and then you got to go to the nearest watering hole and try and make all the drunks believe that you just saw aliens. Right.
Right. And it's not the first time either that we hear that, we're trying to injure or shoot at something and it doesn't harm them, like they're protected by some thick barrier or something like that, or they'll disappear in a flash of light or something like that. So this isn't the first case of that either, even back in the early 50s like this. So we've heard this throughout.
We have.
Yeah.
So despite the dramatic events involved in this case, despite the level of documentation, the amount of covers that existed at the time, times, dates, witnesses, their addresses, where they lived when they had these encounters, this case is very rarely discussed in mainstream circles. And I'm talking about general paranormal, ufology, and cryptozoology, even though it toes a line into all of those. Why do we think that is? What might be a reason for that?
I'm wondering if part of that is simply because it has elements of each individual one. So where do we categorize it? The people that are specifically, I don't know if you've noticed that each of these groups tends to kind of hoard in their own little corner for the most part. Nobody wants to share information. So if you don't have a case that's clearly a cryptid case or a UFO case or a paranormal case, then it probably just goes by the wayside. Instead of just fighting over it, I guess. Where does it fit? It tends to be in all three of those. So they just kind of like go. I think that would be part of the reason.
I think Heather makes some really important points right there, because you do tend to see that. Right, and this comes back to what you talked about earlier, Mark. The different camps, they want a UFO case to be really credible with, a saucer. Spheres are okay sometimes, maybe triangles, but you can give me a good saucer, that's going to be best. And I want the beings to be smaller than humans, no hair on the head, no hair anywhere, preferably. If they're just small, they've got big bald heads, but they got to be big. It's got to show that they're smart, and they've got to have some display of advanced technology, and usually collecting a soil sample for the International Soil Sample Museum. But these tropes, in other words, are what end up being injected into what a good UFO case is supposed to be. When you have outliers like this, nobody wants to claim it because they're like, well, that's not my kind of UFO sighting. And it's certainly not the kind of hairy biped sighting that I expect to see. It's not a big dumb ape walking around eating berries, and engaging in animalistic behavior, right? But the other thing is, too, I do think that there's this sort of national identity component, which, again, my own experience traveling to South America several times, I see this all the time. I hear American skeptics say the American, fixation and fascination with UFOs and how it's an American problem is in United States. They call this all different kinds of things, but I dispute that. If you spend time in other countries and talk to the UFO groups there, if you speak to former elected officials like I've done in Brazil, ufologists in Brazil, common people who have seen things that they can't explain, they are wrestling with the same questions that we are. But especially prior to the advent of the World Wide Web, cases like this, with the select readership because again, it comes through a very narrow funnel to the United States. Somebody writes a letter, makes its way to the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization. So Jim and Coral Lorenzen may write about it in a newsletter. What's its circulation, right? Yep. Very limited at that time. And it doesn't make a huge splash. If that had happened today, the question would be, what would the response be? Would it end up being front page news? Would it be a world story? But it couldn't have been that,
And I wonder too if there's a element of like the skinwalker effect, where it was seen as something evil or bad or scary, and that they didn't want to talk about those kind of things. And now we kind of have this new category, right, of the high strangeness. So it kind of fits right into the high strangeness categories of that. So I wonder if that was part of the reason it was kind of, pushed under too.
And to dovetail on what Micah was saying too, I see a very, very broad parallel between this case and Chupacabra. The main difference being exactly what was stated right at the end, the narrow funnel. The game changer with the Chupacabra was the internet. Mm-hmm. There you had, away from us, away from the continental United States setting, very strange, very sort of culturally conditioned case. But the difference with Chupacabra is the internet was getting going, a college student could put a web page together, which is what happened with Chupacabra, and now it was being reported. Anyone could have access to it instantly. And then that was corroborated with television reporting. And then when it jumps to the United States, it goes like wildfire. So, this is maybe Caracas would have been as big as Chupacabra if the internet would have been a thing at the time that it took place.
That's an interesting, because why did it take 70 some years for, maybe I'm elevating us a little bit too much, but these aren't conversations I've heard before in correlation to this case. Why did it take 70 years? You know what I mean? And hopefully this conversation continues. I don't think we've solved anything. I hope people pick this up and continue to research it and look at it, because as we've said, it is a very important case. But, we can kind of see throughout history a tendency on the part of many researchers to, like Micah said, with issues of national identity, we don't always look at other parts of the world. We don't necessarily appreciate that there is a very rich tableau of not just UFO sightings, but very deep folklore and mythology that does have modern connections to this day. And I think this case is a really interesting example of that.
I would hope that a conversation like this, kind of to your earlier point, would encourage the whole community away from kind of an exceptionalism that the only reports we'll really consider are from here at home, but will cause us to look at other sources. And there will be some work to navigate cultural differences, language differences, but I think it's worth it.
Yeah.
To see, again, to gather as much as we possibly can.
The case of the Caracas Dwarves is striking for a number of reasons, and as we've learned today, may be drastically underexamined by the UFO community. If nothing else, it may remind us to look beyond the borders of our own home for anomalous phenomena, and to reassess what category a specific case may fall into. Perhaps one day we'll know more. But for now, this concludes our discussion on the Caracas Dwarves.